The year was 1958, and the late summer heat in Harlem was not merely a matter of temperature, it was a physical weight, a suffocating, invisible presence that pressed down on the melting asphalt and settled deep into the weary bones of the city. The air was thick and punishing, carrying the mingled, unforgettable scents of roasted peanuts from street vendors, the harsh bite of leaded exhaust fumes from passing Cadillacs, and the sweet, sharp tang of bay rum aftershave drifting out from the neighborhood barber shops that stayed open long after the sun had finally dipped below the horizon. It was a time when the world was rapidly shifting, when the lines of global power were being violently redrawn across the map, but on the grid of streets above 110th, the order of things remained absolute and unyielding. It was a kingdom hidden in plain sight, functioning by its own laws, breathing its own rhythm, and like all true kingdoms throughout history, it had a king. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual, deeply shadowed corner booth at Small's Paradise, entirely cloaked in the dim, red-tinted light that made the legendary jazz club feel less like a tavern and more like a sacred sanctuary. To the uninitiated, to the tourists or the oblivious downtown elites who occasionally wandered too far north, Bumpy was just a quiet, older man nursing a glass of neat, top-shelf bourbon. He wore a midnight blue suit, cut with such meticulous, razor-sharp precision by a legendary Italian tailor down in the garment district that the fabric seemed to absorb the very light around him. His fedora was tilted at a precise angle, shadowing his heavy, intelligent eyes. But to the men and women who lived, bled, and died by the unforgiving rhythm of these streets, he was much more than a man in a sharp suit. He was the architect of their reality. He was the heavy concrete dam holding back the flood of absolute chaos. He was a man who played a complex, 40-year game of multidimensional chess while the rest of the city was merely playing checkers in the dirt. The club was vibrantly alive with the frantic, brilliant, almost desperate energy of a Saturday night in late August. On the small, elevated wooden stage at the back of the room, a brass quintet was tearing through a rapid-fire bebop standard. The trumpet player, a young cat from Chicago with cheeks puffed out like balloons, was blowing with a desperate, beautiful fury. His eyes were squeezed tightly shut, heavy drops of sweat beading on his forehead and rolling down the collar of his damp white shirt. He wasn't just playing notes, he was exercising demons, pouring all the pain, the joy, and the relentless struggle of the black experience in America through the polished brass bell of his horn. The stand-up bassist plucked the thick strings with calloused fingers, laying down a walking bass line that vibrated through the floorboards and directly into the chests of every patron in the room. The air inside Small's Paradise was a dense, intoxicating haze of blue cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and the continuous musical clinking of heavy ice cubes in thick crystal highball glasses. It was a place where the working class of Harlem, the postal workers whose backs ached from carrying heavy bags all week, the auto mechanics with permanent grease under their fingernails, the tired, fiercely loving mothers, and the sharp-eyed corner hustlers could come together and feel like absolute royalty for a few fleeting hours. They wore their absolute best clothes. The men sported perfectly pressed slacks and their finest Sunday hats. Their shoes shined to a mirror finish. The women wore elegant, tailored dresses, their hair meticulously styled, pearls resting against their collarbones. They left their profound daily troubles, the indignities of a segregated society, and the constant grinding pressure of survival at the coat check. Once they stepped onto that sprawling wooden floor, they surrendered entirely to the music and the magic of the night. Bumpy watched them all with a quiet, abiding, almost paternal respect. He took a slow, deeply measured drag from his imported, hand-rolled Cuban cigar. The tip glowed like a sudden, fierce warning beacon in the dark confines of his booth. He held the rich, heavy smoke in his lungs for a long moment before exhaling a smooth, thick cloud toward the pressed tin ceiling. Bumpy knew the immense struggles of his people because he had lived them, fought through them, and ultimately capitalized on them. He knew exactly how hard it was to earn an honest, folding dollar in a world systematically rigged against their very existence. He knew the profound, unshakable dignity required for these men and women to keep standing tall when the entire machinery of the system was explicitly designed to keep them on their knees. He protected this ecosystem. He fed off it, yes, but he also sheltered it from the absolute worst predators the outside world had to offer. Navigating the incredibly crowded, dimly lit floor with the practiced, flawless grace of a tightrope walker was Clara. She was a local waitress who had been working the tables at Small's Paradise for 3 grueling years. She was a young woman with perpetually tired, soulful brown eyes, but a warm, genuine smile that possessed the rare power to light up the darkest corners of the room. Bumpy knew Clara's story, just as he knew the story of the bartender, the coat check girl, and the bouncer at the front door. Bumpy made it his absolute business to know the intimate details of everyone who operated within his territory. Knowledge was currency, and Bumpy Johnson was the wealthiest man in Harlem. Clara was currently pulling her 3rd consecutive double shift of the week. She was carrying massively heavy, silver-plated trays loaded with sloshing highballs, neat scotches, and steaming plates of golden fried chicken until the soles of her feet went entirely numb and her lower back screamed in protest. She did all of this, suffering the grueling physical toll to pay for her younger sister's expensive nursing school tuition down at a prestigious college in Atlanta. Clara was the very definition of the neighborhood's beating heartbeat, resilient, uncomplaining, fiercely proud, and intensely focused on elevating her family. Bumpy watched her balance a sprawling tray of drinks high above her shoulder, weaving through the tightly packed, circular tables with the elegant, fluid motion of a dancer. She offered a polite, respectful nod to a pair of older gentlemen here, a warm, melodic laugh to a group of well-dressed ladies there. She was a master of her craft, invisible when she needed to be, and a ray of sunshine when the moment called for it. For hours, the night proceeded perfectly. The music swelled and dipped, the liquor flowed, and the heavy humidity of the street was momentarily forgotten. Then, the sacred rhythm of the room was violently, irreparably broken. It wasn't a sudden stop in the jazz music, nor was it a loud shout. It was a subtle, sickening, atmospheric shift in the very air pressure of the club, like a freezing cold draft blowing suddenly through the open doorway of a warm, bustling home. The heavy, intricately carved oak front doors of Small's Paradise were shoved open with an aggressive, careless force that made the brass hinges groan in protest. A group of 4 men walked into the club. Instantly, the collective instinct of the room flared. Every street-smart individual in Small's Paradise felt the hair on the back of their necks stand up. These men did not belong here. It wasn't simply a matter of their complexion, though they were strikingly different, possessing the olive skin and sharp aristocratic features of Middle Eastern nobility. It was the sheer, suffocating, radiating aura of absolute entitlement that announced their disruptive arrival before they even opened their mouths. They walked with a terrifying, arrogant looseness. They were an entourage of foreign oil diplomats. They were billionaires, the privileged sons of a sovereign oil-rich state across the globe. These were men whose immense wealth was not measured in bank accounts, but in deep ancient reserves of black gold, in fleets of private aircraft, and in ancestral palaces. Their power was so vast, so deeply entrenched in the gears of the global economy, that it was entirely incomprehensible to the hard-working people currently sipping bourbon and listening to bebop. They were currently residing in New York City for a high-level United Nations assembly, surrounded by mayors, senators, and federal agents who bowed and scraped to accommodate their every whim. But tonight, they had grown bored of the sanitized, overly polite galas of Manhattan. Tonight, they had deliberately decided to slum it. They had ordered their heavily armored, chauffeur-driven limousines to journey deep uptown to look at the colorful, musical locals. They were treating Harlem, a complex, breathing community of human beings, not as a neighborhood, but as a gritty, exotic petting zoo. This was a safari for their own twisted amusement, a chance to mock the peasants from the absolute safety of their diplomatic shields. Leading this pack of wolves was a man known in elite, whispered diplomatic circles as the Attach. He was a tall, imposing man with razor-sharp, patrician features, slick, heavily oiled dark hair pulled straight back from a severe widow's peak, and cold, dead eyes that were completely devoid of any recognizable human empathy. He wore a bespoke, shimmering silk suit tailored in Milan that cost more money than an entire Harlem family would earn in 10 years of back-breaking labor. On his left wrist rested a solid gold Patek Philippe timepiece that caught the dim red lighting and flashed like a strobe. A cruel, permanent sneer seemed deeply etched into the fine lines around his mouth. He didn't walk so much as he glided across the floorboards, entirely expecting the dense sea of humanity to simply part before his overwhelming god-like importance. Silas, the club's general manager, was a perpetually nervous, balding man who was always sweating completely through his starched white collar. He had the survival instincts of a cornered rabbit, and the moment the heavy doors swung open, he recognized the terrifying scent of international money and the absolute danger of foreign power. Silas practically sprinted forward to intercept them, his polished shoes sliding on the floorboards. He bowed deeply, his hands nervously wringing a damp white bar towel. Gentlemen, welcome to Small's Paradise," Silas stammered, his voice tight with anxiety. "We are deeply honored by your presence. Please, allow me to accommodate you." Without waiting for a response, Silas hastily rushed toward the center of the room. He targeted the largest, most coveted VIP booth, an expansive horseshoe-shaped arrangement of red leather located perfectly between the bar and the stage. The problem was, the booth was already occupied by a group of local regulars, respectable, older men who had spent their entire week's pay to enjoy a night of dignity. Silas, driven by sheer panic and the ingrained fear of powerful men, approached the table and began frantically whispering, gesturing wildly for the men to vacate. The regulars grumbled, their faces tightening with insult and humiliation, but they saw the sheer terror in Silas's eyes, and they saw the 4 silk-suited billionaires waiting with impatient, mocking expressions. Reluctantly, with heavy sighs that spoke of a lifetime of being pushed aside, the local men stood up, gathered their coats, and moved to a cramped inferior table near the swinging kitchen doors. The diplomats did not offer a word of thanks. They did not acknowledge the displaced men. They simply swept into the massive red leather booth, instantly sprawling out and taking up entirely too much space. They draped their arms over the backrests, crossing their legs so their expensive Italian leather shoes protruded into the walking aisles. They immediately began speaking loudly to one another in their native rapid-fire language. Their voices were harsh, guttural, and deeply piercing, cutting violently over the smooth, melodic jazz pouring from the stage. They laughed entirely too hard, a booming, arrogant sound that demanded everyone's attention. The attach pointed his manicured, ring-covered fingers directly at the musicians on the stage, mocking the young trumpet player's worn, scuffed shoes. Another diplomat pointed at the elegantly dressed women dancing near the polished mahogany bar, his eyes raking up and down their bodies with a leering, predatory gaze. It was the look of men who fundamentally believed that absolutely everything and everyone in the world had a designated price tag, and they possessed the unlimited checkbook to purchase it all. Deep in his shadowed corner booth, effectively invisible to the arrogant billionaires, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not move a single muscle. His posture remained perfectly relaxed, his expression an utterly neutral, ice-cold mask of pure observation. He looked like a statue carved from dark mahogany, but his eyes, dark, intelligent, and fiercely calculating, tracked the attache's every single movement. He catalogued the disrespect. He measured the volume of their laughter. He calculated the precise weight of their insult to his territory. Standing exactly 10 feet away from Bumpy's booth, leaning casually against a thick, load-bearing support pillar near the bustling bar, was Illinois Gordon. Illinois was a terrifying mountain of a man, an enforcer carved directly from the unforgiving concrete of Harlem. His physical presence was massive, his shoulders as wide as a doorway. His face looked like a ruined, deeply weathered church, a roadmap of old, jagged scars and improperly healed broken bones that told the violent, uncompromising story of a man who survived solely by being significantly harder than the brutal world around him. Illinois spoke the grim, final language of violence with absolute fluency, but he was no wild dog. He was a fiercely disciplined, perfectly trained soldier. He operated on a strict, unbreakable, invisible leash held tightly by the quiet man sitting in the corner booth. Illinois took a slow sip of his bubbling club soda, his heavy, hooded eyes locked intently onto the sprawling foreign billionaires. He didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight. He merely looked over his massive shoulder toward the corner booth. He sought the king's eyes. Bumpy met Illinois' gaze through the smoky haze, but Bumpy offered absolutely no signal. His chin remained level. His eyes remained calm. Not yet. You do not move until the enemy has fully revealed their flank. You do not strike until the board is perfectly set. Over at the displaced VIP table, the attach was thoroughly enjoying holding court. He felt like a Roman emperor inspecting a newly conquered, dirt-poor province. He raised his right hand high into the air and snapped his fingers with a sharp, incredibly disrespectful, cracking sound, loudly demanding service like a master summoning a field hand. Silas practically tripped over his own feet, rushing over, nodding frantically like a bobblehead doll. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket, his hands shaking slightly. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. What can I bring for your esteemed party tonight?" Silas asked, his voice dripping with forced, terrified subservience. The attach didn't even bother to look up at Silas. He inspected his fingernails. "Bring us your most expensive bottles of cognac, 3 of them, and bring a bucket of fresh ice. Do not bring me the swill you serve to these people." The attach waved his hand dismissively toward the rest of the club, his voice heavily accented, but perfectly, brutally clear in English. He intentionally spoke loudly. He desperately wanted the people sitting at the surrounding tables to hear his words. He wanted them to feel the crushing weight of their own insignificance in his presence. And make absolutely certain the crystal glasses are meticulously clean, the attach barked, finally locking his cold eyes onto Silas's sweating face. This entire place smells intensely of cheap grease and profound, pathetic desperation. I do not wish to catch whatever filthy diseases these local animals carry in their blood. The insult hung in the hot, smoky air like a toxic gas. A few tables away, a young, broad-shouldered man in a factory uniform suddenly stood up. His fists clenched tightly at his sides, his knuckles turning white. His pride, the fragile, vital pride of a hard-working man, had been deeply wounded by the casual, venomous insult. He took a half-step toward the VIP booth, his jaw locked in fury. But immediately, an older, gray-haired man sitting beside him reached up and grabbed the young man's forearm with surprisingly strong fingers. The older man pulled him back down into his wooden chair, shaking his head slowly, his eyes wide with a desperate warning. The older man knew the unspoken rules of the world. You do not start a street war with untouchable men who possess heavily fortified embassies, private security armies, and the direct phone numbers of federal judges. You swallow the bitter, burning poison of their disrespect, you look down at your shoes, and you survive to see tomorrow's sunrise. The attach noticed the young man's sudden, suppressed display of anger. Instead of feeling threatened, the billionaire threw his head back and laughed. It was a dry, rasping, terrible sound that lacked any genuine humor or warmth. He turned back to his three companions, casually retrieving a solid gold cigarette case from his breast pocket. "Look at them," the attach sneered, his lips curling in supreme amusement as he tapped a gold-tipped cigarette against the case. "They actually believe they have rights. They truly think they are human beings of equal standing. They simply do not understand the absolute reality of how the real world operates." He placed the cigarette between his lips, and one of his companions instantly produced a silver lighter, snapping a flame to life. The attach inhaled deeply, blowing a thick stream of gray smoke directly across the table. "We could burn this entire pathetic, crumbling neighborhood to the ground tonight, simply for our own warmth," the attach declared, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying certainty. "And the mayor of this pathetic, garbage-filled city would personally crawl on his hands and knees to shine my shoes tomorrow morning, begging for forgiveness for the smoke that inconvenienced me. We are entirely untouchable here, gentlemen. We are invincible ghosts driving vehicles with diplomatic plates." It was a monstrous, ego-driven boast, but to the deep, silent horror of everyone listening, it was also a terrifying, irrefutable legal truth. Diplomatic immunity was an absolute, impenetrable shield forged by international treaties. These four men could commit any conceivable crime. They could steal, they could assault, they could break every law written in the city charter, and the local New York City Police Department would be legally, strictly bound by federal law to arrest anyone who tried to stop them, before safely escorting the diplomats back to the luxurious confines of their consulate. They were, by the strict, cold definition of international law, literal gods walking among the vulnerable working class, and they reveled in the sickness of that power. From the kitchen hallway, Clara emerged. She took a deep, steadying breath, preparing herself to enter the lion's den. She was carrying a massive, incredibly heavy circular silver tray. Perfectly balanced on the polished metal were 3 unopened, dust-covered bottles of the club's absolute finest, oldest, and most fiercely guarded vintage French cognac. Beside the bottles sat 4 heavy crystal snifters and a large, intricately cut crystal bucket overflowing with crushed ice and thick geometric ice cubes. Her feet were screaming in blinding, hot agony from 12 hours of continuous, unforgiving walking. Her slender shoulders ached intensely under the sheer physical weight of the tray, her muscles burning with fatigue. But Clara kept her polite, professional, unbreakable smile firmly plastered in place. She knew exactly what kind of men these were. She had served incredibly arrogant, dangerous men before, men who mistakenly thought a thick handful of dirty cash magically bought them the absolute right to treat her like a piece of rented furniture. Clara's survival strategy was always identical, honed through years of harsh experience: keep your head down, avoid direct eye contact, serve the expensive drinks with flawless precision, and get out of the immediate blast radius as quickly as humanly possible. She stepped up cautiously to the outer edge of the sprawling red leather booth. "Your vintage cognac, gentlemen," Clara said softly. Her voice was pleasant, steady, and entirely devoid of any challenging tone. She leaned forward over the massive table to place the heavy silver tray down onto the wooden surface. It was a delicate operation requiring absolute precision, forcing her to carefully maneuver the heavy tray around their protruding elbows, their discarded napkins, and the large, overflowing glass ashtrays they had already managed to thoroughly dirty with their expensive ashes. At that exact, microscopic fraction of a second, the attach decided to emphasize a point. He was telling a boisterous, entirely self-centered joke to the man sitting across from him about a massive, multi-million-dollar yacht he had recently purchased in Monaco. To deliver the punchline, he violently threw his right arm backward in a wild, sudden, deeply exaggerated gesture. He didn't bother to look behind him. A man of his supreme, elevated stature never checks his blind spots, because he fundamentally believes the world should proactively move out of his way. The attachee's elbow swung back with significant force, completely blind to Clara's presence. His elbow slammed incredibly hard, directly into the heavy, solid silver underside of Clara's massively overloaded tray. The immediate physics of the violent collision were sudden and inevitable. The tray bucked upward and tipped violently to the left. Clara gasped sharply, her exhausted, burning arms straining beyond their absolute limits. Her fingers desperately, fiercely gripped the polished silver edge, her knuckles turning bone white as she fought a desperate, losing battle against gravity to keep the priceless vintage bottles from crashing down onto the hardwood floor. Through sheer, miraculous willpower and an intense burst of adrenaline, Clara succeeded in saving the liquor. She forcefully leveled the heavy tray, her muscles shaking violently, preventing the 3 bottles of cognac from falling. But she could not perfectly stabilize the crystal ice bucket. The sudden, violent jolt of the tray caused the heavy crystal bucket to tip just a single, devastating inch. A single, solid, heavy square cube of ice escaped from the mountain of crushed ice. It tumbled silently through the smoky air, catching the red club lights as it fell. It struck the hard wooden edge of the VIP table and instantly shattered into a tiny, explosive spray of freezing cold water. A single, solitary drop of that cold water flew through the air. It landed precisely on the pristine, shimmering, custom-tailored, $10,000 silk cuff of the attache's jacket. Suddenly, the vibrant, energetic music pouring from the stage seemed to stretch, warp, and distort. time inside the crowded walls of Small's paradise slowed down to a devastating, agonizing crawl. The attach instantly stopped talking mid-sentence. He slowly, deliberately lowered his raised arm. He looked down at his left wrist. He stared intently at the tiny, almost invisible dark stain of moisture currently resting on the impossibly expensive, shimmering silk fabric of his cuff. He stared at it with a look of profound, uncomprehending horror, as if Clara had just reached out and handed him a live, ticking hand grenade. The absolute, suffocating silence that immediately fell over his 3 billionaire companions was thick, heavy, and intensely toxic. The laughter died in their throats. They stared at the drop of water like it was a fatal insult to their entire bloodline. Clara, realizing what had just occurred, immediately began to apologize. Her voice was trembling violently, her heart suddenly hammering aggressively against her ribs like a trapped, panicked bird desperately trying to escape a cage. "I am so sorry, sir. I am so incredibly sorry. Please, allow me to get a clean towel immediately. It was an accident, I swear. You bumped the tray, but I am so sorry." The attach didn't look at the tiny water stain anymore. He slowly rotated his neck and looked up at Clara. When he looked at her, he did not see a human being standing before him. He did not see a young, exhausted woman working a grueling double shift to help elevate her family out of poverty. He looked at her with the cold, dead, utterly soulless eyes of a venomous reptile, calmly examining an irritating, insignificant fly that had foolishly landed on its pristine scales. He did not stand up. He did not utter a single, solitary word of anger or warning. He did not show a microscopic flicker of human hesitation, remorse, or basic decency. Sitting perfectly still, the attach simply raised his right hand, curled his fingers slightly, and viciously backhanded Clara squarely across the left side of her face. It was not a warning strike designed to frighten her. It was not a light slap meant to humiliate. It was a vicious, calculated, full-force physical blow delivered by a grown man who wore several heavy, solid gold rings on his thick fingers. The sharp, brutal, sickening crack of heavy gold metal and human bone, violently colliding, echoed instantly through the entire expanse of the club. It was a sound so sharp and devastating that it cut entirely through the heavy jazz music like a literal gunshot, ringing in the ears of every patron present. Clara was physically lifted off her feet and thrown violently backward by the sheer, unexpected violence of the massive impact. The heavy, silver-plated tray finally flew completely from her exhausted hands. The 3 priceless bottles of vintage French cognac crashed violently against the wooden floorboards, instantly shattering into hundreds of razor-sharp pieces, sending a massive wave of expensive amber liquid and dangerous shards of thick green glass exploding aggressively in absolutely every direction. Clara hit the hardwood floor incredibly hard. Her head bounced painfully against the thick wooden leg of a neighboring dining chair. She lay there on the ground, entirely stunned, her vision swimming in dark, dizzying circles. Her hand instantly flew up to cover her cheek, which was already swelling massively. A bright, thin, terrifying line of crimson blood began trickling steadily from the corner of her split, deeply bruised lip, dripping down onto her white waitress uniform. Now, the music died entirely. The vibrant soul of the club was extinguished in a millisecond. The trumpet player on the stage immediately lowered his brass horn, his eyes wide with shock. The drummer froze perfectly still, his wooden sticks hovering silently just an inch over the snare drum. A massive, collective gasp of profound horror and deep, boiling outrage aggressively sucked absolutely all the oxygen out of the room at Small's paradise. Across the floor, men immediately stood up, dozens of them. Heavy wooden chairs scraped violently and loudly against the floorboards as patrons rose to their feet. The air inside the club turned instantly, terrifyingly electric, suddenly heavy with the absolute, undeniable, and utterly terrifying promise of a massive, bloody street riot. The hard-working men of Harlem were not going to sit down and watch a foreign billionaire assault a woman in their sanctuary. Fists were clenching. Knives were quietly being unclasped in deep pockets. No, 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 please. Everyone stay exactly where you are. Stay back. Silas, the terrified manager, shrieked at the top of his lungs. He sprinted frantically out from behind the safety of the mahogany bar, his face completely pale and drained of all blood. He aggressively threw his own body between the rising, furious crowd of locals and the VIP booth holding the diplomats. Silas held his trembling hands high up in the air in a desperate, pleading gesture for immediate peace. Silas knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, exactly what these four men truly were. He knew the absolute reality of the world they lived in. If a furious Harlem crowd laid a single, violent finger on a foreign diplomat of this magnitude, the United States federal government would come crashing down on the entire neighborhood tomorrow morning with the absolute, unyielding, destructive wrath of the military. They would close the club, arrest 100 men, and throw away the keys forever. Tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes, Silas dropped straight down onto his hands and knees, plunging directly into the growing, sticky puddles of spilled vintage cognac and dangerous, jagged, broken glass. He ignored the sharp glass cutting into his trousers. He reached out with trembling hands to help Clara, pulling her up gently by her slender shoulders, physically shielding her battered body with his own. "Are you all right, Clara? Don't speak. Just go to the back. Go to the kitchen right this second, please. Just go." Silas whispered frantically into her ear, practically shoving her away from the dangerous gravity of the VIP table. Clara stumbled away, completely disoriented, heavy tears streaming rapidly down her face, mixing with the blood. She clutched her bleeding jaw tightly, disappearing backward into the dark, protective shadows of the kitchen hallway. Silas slowly turned back around to face the VIP booth. He remained on his knees in the spilled liquor, his face pale, his entire body trembling violently with a mixture of intense fear and suppressed rage. Sir, I am so incredibly, deeply sorry for the profound incompetence of my staff," Silas choked out, swallowing his own pride to save his club. "I will personally cover the entire cost of the cleaning for your beautiful jacket. I will completely comp your entire evening's bill. Food, drinks, everything is entirely free. Please, I am begging you, we do not want any trouble here tonight." Inside the spacious booth, the attached slowly, casually stood up. He looked down at his slightly damp silk cuff. He casually raised his right hand and lazily brushed a microscopic, invisible speck of dust from his wide lapel. He looked down at Silas, who was still kneeling pathetically in the spilled, expensive liquor, and then he slowly panned his dead reptilian eyes across the angry, tense crowd of black men and women aggressively surrounding them. The attached did not look afraid of the angry mob. He didn't even look mildly concerned. He looked profoundly, genuinely amused by their pathetic display of anger. "Trouble?" The attached laughed loudly. It was a dark, echoing, terrible sound. He casually reached his hand deep into the inner, silk-lined breast pocket of his miraculously tailored, lightly stained jacket. He smoothly pulled out a massive, tightly banded stack of crisp, brand-new $100 bills. It was a stack of absolute wealth, so thick it easily represented more money than Silas, the manager, took home in 3 entire years of grinding labor. "You foolishly believe this is trouble?" the attached sneered, his voice dripping with pure concentrated venom and absolute arrogance. "I am a personal, protected guest of the United States federal government. I carry the absolute sovereign seal of a king in my pocket. If I truly wanted to, if I was even slightly irritated rather than just deeply amused, I could have that stupid, clumsy, primitive animal dragged out into the dirty street right now and beaten to death with iron pipes, and your own city police would proudly stand guard around me to ensure I wasn't." Rudely interrupted while I watched. He slowly, deliberately peeled off a thick, heavy chunk of the crisp $100 bills from the top of the massive stack. He didn't hand the money down to Silas. He didn't place it on the table. With a sharp, violent, utterly degrading flick of his wrist, the attach threw the heavy, tightly packed wad of cash directly downward, smashing it violently into the kneeling manager's face. The heavy stack of crisp bills forcefully struck Silas directly in the cheek. The paper band snapped from the impact, and the money immediately exploded outward into a massive, fluttering cloud of bright green paper, raining down slowly and mockingly over the manager's head, settling into the sharp broken glass and the spilled amber alcohol. "There is your pathetic compensation, little man," the attach stated loudly, his voice ringing through the silent club with absolute, tyrannical, untouchable authority. "That is for the dry cleaning of my silk, and it is for the profound, sickening displeasure of having to breathe the exact same oxygen as you primitive, uncultured animals. Pick it up. Pick the money up off the dirty floor exactly like the obedient dog you are." The attach turned away from Silas in utter disgust. He looked at his 3 billionaire companions, a cruel, satisfied smirk plastered across his face. "Come, gentlemen," the attach commanded smoothly, adjusting his gold cuffs. "The overwhelming stench of this garbage dump is finally making me nauseous. The entertainment has severely degraded. We are leaving this place." Throughout this entire, horrifying ordeal, deep in the darkest, most isolated corner booth of the club, thoroughly cloaked in the heavy red shadows, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had not blinked. He had sat perfectly still. He had watched Clara struggle with the heavy tray. He had watched the drop of water fall. He had watched the brutal, unprovoked strike that sent a hard-working woman crashing to the floor. He had watched the bright red blood spill from her lip. He had watched the foreign billionaire throw a fortune in cash directly into the face of a terrified man desperately begging for peace. Most importantly, he had listened very, very closely as the arrogant, untouchable god of international law openly declared himself entirely, legally immune to any and all consequences of his brutal actions. Bumpy slowly, smoothly reached his right hand out. He placed the remaining half of his expensive, glowing Cuban cigar gently into the heavy crystal ashtray resting on his table. He pressed the bright orange cherry firmly down against the glass, extinguishing the hot ember with a slow, deliberate, intensely violent twisting motion of his wrist until nothing remained but crushed ash. He didn't shout in anger. He didn't kick his table over. He didn't quickly reach beneath his immaculate jacket to draw the heavy caliber, fully loaded pistol resting comfortably in his leather shoulder holster. He simply lifted his dark, calculating gaze directly across the tense, violently silent, smoke-filled room. through the crowd, through the tension, he made absolute unbroken eye contact with the massive enforcer leaning against the wooden pillar. Bumpy looked directly at Illinois Gordon, and then Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson gave a nod. It was a microscopic, almost invisible physical movement. It was a mere fraction of an inch, a simple, silent dipping of his chin, but in the complex, fragile, and highly volatile ecosystem of the Harlem underworld, that single, silent visual command was the direct, undeniable equivalent of a heavy, solid steel bank vault slamming permanently shut. The absolute finality of the gesture echoed louder than a bomb. Illinois Gordon saw the nod. He did not immediately push his massive frame off the wooden pillar. He did not move aggressively toward the VIP table to confront the billionaires. He did not reach into his coat and pull a weapon. Instead, moving with a terrifying, absolute mechanical calmness, Illinois Gordon turned his massive back entirely on the arrogant diplomats. He began walking at a slow, measured, unhurried pace directly toward the main front entrance of the nightclub. Over at the VIP booth, the Attach and his 3 wealthy men were currently stepping out from behind the table. They were casually adjusting their silk cuffs, smoothing their ties, and laughing amongst themselves in their guttural language, totally oblivious to the massive, invisible tectonic plates violently shifting beneath their expensive leather shoes. They fully believed they were simply ending their safari. They believed they were about to casually walk out the front doors, step into the air-conditioned safety of their waiting, armored limousines, and disappear back into the untouchable stratosphere of international immunity. They did not understand that the rules of gravity had just been rewritten. As Illinois Gordon reached the front entrance, he completely ignored the terrified coat-check girl cowering behind her counter. He reached his massive, scarred hand directly behind the heavy, red velvet curtains that draped the entryway. From the shadows, Illinois pulled out a massive, thick, deeply rusted iron logging chain. The heavy iron links were terrifyingly large, each one as thick as a grown man's wrist. The chain was heavy, completely cold, and entirely unforgiving. Attached securely to the very end of the iron chain was a massive, solid, heavy-duty brass padlock. Clank, clank, clank. The incredibly heavy, grinding, metallic sound of the thick iron chain slowly dragging across the hardwood floorboards violently cut through the tense silence of the club. The Attach suddenly paused his confident stride, his arrogant brow furrowed in genuine, sudden confusion. He stopped laughing. He slowly turned his head and looked toward the front door. He watched, suddenly paralyzed by a completely foreign, rapidly creeping sense of absolute confusion, as the giant, scarred man methodically lifted the heavy iron chain. Illinois Gordon calmly threaded the thick metal links directly through the large, ornate brass handles of the double oak front doors. Illinois pulled the iron chain violently tight. He looped it through the handles once, twice, 3 times. He pulled with the massive strength of a draft horse, ensuring there was absolutely, positively no slack remaining in the thick metal. The heavy oak doors were pulled completely flush, sealed tighter than a submarine hatch. Illinois then took the massive, heavy brass padlock. He calmly threaded the thick metal shackle directly through the final, intersecting links of the rusted iron chain. He gripped the heavy brass lock in his massive hand. He squeezed it. Click. The heavy mechanical sound of the thick metal lock snapping permanently shut was absolute. It was a terrifying, definitive sound. It was the sound of a world instantly ending. Illinois Gordon slowly turned his massive body back around to face the interior of the club. He calmly crossed his giant muscular arms tightly over his broad chest. He leaned his heavy back directly against the thick, tightly chained oak doors, completely blocking the only exit in the entire building. He stared dead at the 4 foreign billionaires standing frozen in the middle of the floor, a dark, completely empty, terrifying smile slowly playing on his deeply scarred lips. The attache's arrogant, untouchable smirk finally vanished from his aristocratic face. He looked at the massive, rusted iron chains currently holding the doors closed. He looked at the terrifying giant standing in front of them. Then, the attache slowly turned his head and looked around the room. He realized that the massive crowd of angry, working-class locals were no longer backing away in fear. They were no longer intimidated by his wealth. Slowly, silently, the men and women of Harlem were stepping forward. They were closing in tightly around the VIP table from all sides, crossing their arms, blocking the aisles, forming a solid, impenetrable, suffocating wall of angry human bodies. The cold realization finally washed over the billionaire. He was no longer standing inside a nightclub. He was standing inside a locked cage. And from the deep red shadows of the isolated corner booth, moving with the slow, terrifying, inevitable grace of a predator that had finally cornered its absolute prey, the king of Harlem slowly stood up. The soft, rhythmic sound of genuine leather sliding against polished hardwood was the only noise that dared to exist inside the suffocating vacuum of the nightclub. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not rush. He did not storm across the floor with the unhinged, sloppy rage of a lesser man. He moved with the terrifying, hypnotic fluidity of a deep-water leviathan rising slowly to the surface. Every single step he took was a perfectly calculated, microscopic exertion of absolute dominance. The angry, tightly packed wall of Harlem locals, men and women who were practically vibrating with boiling, righteous fury just a second prior, immediately sensed the shifting atmospheric pressure at his approach. They did not need to be told to move. The very instinct of survival woven into their DNA commanded them to step aside. The dense crowd parted silently, smoothly, creating a narrow, perfectly straight path through the sea of human bodies, leading directly from the dark shadows of the corner booth to the sprawling, ruined VIP table. The attache stood completely frozen in the center of the clearing, his expensive leather shoes resting inches away from the shattered green glass and the spreading, sticky pool of vintage amber cognac. He watched this older, sharply dressed black man approaching him. The billionaire's mind, extensively trained in the high-stakes, ruthless world of global politics and international espionage, violently scrambled to categorize the severe threat stepping into his orbit. The man approaching did not wear a police badge. He did not wear the recognizable, starched uniform of a military officer. Yet, the air in front of him seemed to literally solidify. The intense, radiating heat of the angry mob was entirely eclipsed by the absolute, freezing zero of this single individual's aura. Bumpy stopped exactly 3 feet away from the attache. It was the precise, undeniable distance of intimacy and violence. It was close enough to smell the stale, expensive tobacco on the billionaire's breath, close enough to see the microscopic, terrified dilation of his pupils. For an agonizing, stretched-out eternity, Bumpy said absolutely nothing. He simply looked at the man. He didn't look at the shimmering, custom-tailored Milanese silk suit. He didn't look at the heavy, flashing, solid gold Patek Philippe watch that cost more than a brownstone. He didn't look at the thick, insulting wad of $100 bills currently floating in the puddle of spilled liquor at their feet. Bumpy looked directly, piercingly, straight through the attache's dark eyes, drilling violently into the pathetic, shriveled, utterly terrified core of his soul. Bumpy was fundamentally dismantling the man's entire reality, brick by brick, entirely without uttering a single syllable. The Attach's three wealthy companions, men who were usually fiercely arrogant and unshakable, instinctively took a collective half-step backward, practically tripping over the heavy legs of the wooden dining chairs. Their profound arrogance was rapidly evaporating, entirely replaced by the cold, biting, primitive understanding that they were currently trapped in a concrete box with a predator they fundamentally did not understand. "You?" The Attach finally stammered. The harsh, commanding, tyrannical edge of his voice had completely shattered. It was now thin, reedy, and vibrating with an unmistakable, creeping panic. "You are making a profound, catastrophic mistake. I demand that you order that giant animal at the door to remove those chains immediately. I am a foreign diplomat. I have absolute, undeniable immunity. I am a personal, protected guest of the United States." Bumpy slowly tilted his head, adjusting the brim of his fedora by a fraction of an inch. His expression remained an unreadable, deeply carved mask of stone. "Immunity," Bumpy repeated softly. His voice was a rich, deep, gravelly baritone that didn't just fill the tense air, it seemed to vibrate directly inside the ribcages of everyone listening. It was smooth, but heavily textured with the raw, metallic weight of an anvil. "That is a very interesting, very fragile word, my friend. It is a word that belongs on expensive pieces of paper signed by men in comfortable, air-conditioned offices down in Washington." Bumpy slowly reached his right hand up and casually adjusted the lapel of his midnight blue suit. It was a relaxed, entirely unthreatened gesture that paradoxically spiked the Attach's terror to blinding new heights. "But you are not in Washington," Bumpy continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a dangerous, hypnotic purr. "You are not sitting in the leather chairs of the United Nations. You are not hiding behind the tall, heavily guarded iron gates of your beautiful embassy. You have strayed incredibly far from the safety of your map. You are currently standing in Harlem. You are breathing my air. You are standing on my floorboards. And in my kingdom, the only immunity that exists is the exact kind I personally grant you." The Attach's face flushed violently, a desperate mixture of intense humiliation and boiling, panicked anger. He was a billionaire. He was a man who ordered executions before his morning coffee. He could not completely surrender his massive ego, even when staring directly into the abyss. "You arrogant, local fool," the Attach hissed, desperately trying to summon the ghost of his former authority, completely oblivious to the fact that he was arguing with gravity. "You have absolutely no earthly idea who you are currently speaking to. If you touch even a single thread of my jacket, your entire federal government will descend on this pathetic neighborhood. They will completely erase you from existence to satisfy my consulate. I am completely untouchable." Bumpy smiled. It was a terrifying, chilling expression. It did not reach his cold, assessing eyes. It was a smile completely devoid of joy, representing only the grim, undeniable reality of a man who possessed absolute supreme power. "I understand your severe confusion," Bumpy said softly, taking a microscopic, terrifying half-step closer. The physical distance between them was now practically non-existent. "You sincerely believe that your massive wealth and your international treaties function as an invisible shield. You believe that because you fly in private jets and shake hands with presidents, the fundamental laws of cause and effect simply do not apply to you. But you are suffering from a terrible, fatal misunderstanding of geography." Bumpy slowly lifted his right hand. He didn't make a fist. He simply pointed a single, steady, impeccably manicured finger directly at the massive chained oak doors at the front of the club. "Look closely at those heavy iron chains, my friend," Bumpy whispered, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a straight razor. "Look at the thick brass lock. Those chains were not placed there to keep you inside this room. Those chains were placed there to firmly keep your precious United States federal government, your politicians, and your police officers entirely outside." The attach followed Bumpy's finger. He stared at Illinois Gordon, the heavily scarred mountain of a man who was currently leaning against the chained doors, picking casually at his fingernails with a bone-handled switchblade. The reality of his profound isolation finally truly crashed down upon the billionaire like a collapsing building. "In this room," Bumpy stated, his voice now ringing with the heavy, absolute finality of a judge delivering a death sentence, "Washington does not exist. The United Nations does not exist. Your vast, ancient wealth holds absolutely zero purchasing power here. You are completely, entirely bankrupt. You crossed a sacred line. You put your hands on a hard-working woman in my house. You spilled innocent blood on my floor. And now, the heavy bill has finally come due. Panic, raw, undiluted, and completely unmanageable, finally seized the attache's entire nervous system. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He desperately whipped his head around, looking frantically at his three companions, violently, silently begging them to intervene, to fight, to do absolutely anything. But his men were completely paralyzed. They were staring in sheer, unadulterated horror at the massive, impenetrable wall of furious local men surrounding them. The Harlem crowd had silently pulled heavy glass bottles from the tables. They had quietly unclasped heavy straight razors. They were a coiled spring, vibrating with the desperate, hungry desire to tear these arrogant billionaires limb from limb. The only thing, the absolute only force in the universe holding them back from a bloody, chaotic slaughter, was the quiet man in the blue suit. "I will pay you," the attach blurted out, the words tumbling rapidly from his trembling lips in a desperate, pathetic rush. He forcefully shoved his hand deep into his pockets, violently pulling out another massive, rubber-banded stack of $100 bills. He practically shoved the fortune toward Bumpy's chest. "Name your absolute price. 50,000, $100,000, cash, right now. Just tell that giant to open the door and let us walk out of here. Please." Bumpy looked down at the massive stack of crisp green currency. He looked at it with the profound, overwhelming disgust of a man looking at a rotting animal carcass on the side of the road. "You still do not fundamentally understand the game we are playing, do you?" Bumpy sighed softly, a sound of genuine, weary disappointment. "You still mistakenly believe that respect is something you can purchase over a counter. You threw your dirty money into the face of a good, terrified man, deeply believing it erased your monstrous sin. But true respect, the heavy, unbreakable kind of respect that keeps a city functioning, is not printed on paper." Faster than the human eye could effectively track, Bumpy's right hand snapped upward. He didn't punch the attach. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. Bumpy's large, incredibly strong hand shot forward and violently grabbed the attach directly by the front of his shimmering, custom-tailored Milanese silk suit. He seized the fabric just below the collar, his knuckles digging painfully into the billionaire's collarbone. Bumpy possessed the heavy, unyielding physical strength of a man who had survived the most brutal prisons in America, a strength forged in the dark, violent crucibles of Alcatraz and Dannemora. With a sudden, explosive, deeply terrifying exertion of pure physical leverage, Bumpy forcefully yanked the taller man violently forward, completely destroying the billionaire's center of gravity. The attach gasped in shock, his expensive leather shoes violently slipping on the slick, wet floorboards. "Down," Bumpy commanded. It was a single, explosive syllable, delivered with the concussive, devastating force of a mortar shell. Bumpy violently twisted his grip, forcing the attach's massive ego completely downward. The billionaire desperately, instinctively tried to resist, his hands flying up to grab Bumpy's wrists, violently struggling to remain standing. But the resistance was completely, pathetically useless. Bumpy simply shifted his weight, driving his heavy shoulder forward, leveraging the man's own panic against him. With a sickening, heavy thud that rattled the floorboards, the attach was violently forced down onto his hands and knees. He landed directly in the center of the massive, spreading puddle of spilled vintage cognac. The sharp, jagged shards of the shattered green crystal bottles immediately bit deeply into the palms of his manicured hands and sliced cleanly through the knees of his priceless silk trousers. The attach let out a sharp, pathetic whimper of intense physical pain and profound, shattering humiliation. The three remaining billionaires froze in sheer terror. Seeing their untouchable, arrogant leader violently forced to the ground, humiliated like a disobedient child, completely broke their resolve. Bumpy didn't even look at them. He kept his intense, burning gaze firmly locked on the man kneeling in the broken glass. Bumpy simply snapped the fingers of his free left hand. It was a sharp, cracking sound that echoed through the silent club. Instantly, the tight wall of the Harlem crowd took a massive, synchronized step forward. The terrifying, collective movement was overwhelming. The three remaining diplomats didn't wait to be forcefully grabbed. The sheer, suffocating terror of the violently approaching mob broke their minds. They immediately dropped to their hands and knees, scrambling frantically backward on the wet floorboards, their expensive shoes slipping, desperately trying to join their leader in the center of the spilled liquor. They knelt trembling in the broken glass, their heads bowed deeply, their entire bodies shaking violently with the realization that their massive wealth had completely, utterly failed to protect them. Bumpy stood tall above the four kneeling billionaires. He looked down at the attach, who was currently staring in absolute horror at his bleeding palms and his totally ruined, completely soaked silk trousers. "Your money is entirely useless here," Bumpy said slowly, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying, hypnotic rhythm. "Your diplomatic papers are currently sitting uselessly in a briefcase across town. You are entirely stripped of your armor. You are currently nothing more than a deeply disrespectful guest who made a profound, disgusting mess in my home." The attach slowly, painfully raised his head. His perfectly slicked dark hair had fallen wildly into his eyes. His aristocratic face was completely drained of color, his skin a sickly pale gray. The permanent, cruel sneer was entirely gone, violently replaced by the raw, naked, pathetic expression of a terrified, cornered animal. What do you want from me?" the attach whispered, his voice cracking, tears of intense pain and profound humiliation welling in his dark eyes. "Please, just tell me what you want." "I want absolute, meticulous perfection," Bumpy stated coldly. "You loudly declared that this entire establishment was filthy. You deeply insulted the hard-working people of this community, calling them animals. You violently struck a young woman who was simply trying to survive. You threw your dirty money into the face of a terrified man, demanding that he clean up the mess you intentionally created. Bumpy slowly leaned forward, his dark, calculating eyes narrowing to tiny, dangerous slits. The heavy, metallic threat radiating from his posture was absolute. "Now," Bumpy commanded, his voice barely rising above a violent, heavy whisper, "you are going to clean it up." The attach blinked, his mind completely failing to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the demand. Clean it up? With what? Allow me to pay for a mop. Allow me to hire a cleaning crew. You do not understand," Bumpy violently interrupted, his voice cracking like a heavy leather whip. He pointed a firm finger directly down at the billionaire's completely ruined, soaked Milanese silk suit. "You are currently wearing a $10,000 imported Italian rag. You are going to use it." The heavy silence in the nightclub became so dense it was practically solid. The patrons held their collective breath, their eyes wide, completely captivated by the unbelievable, historic scene unfolding before them. The attach stared at his own jacket. He stared at the massive, spreading puddle of sticky amber liquor, the hundreds of jagged shards of broken green crystal, and the tiny, distinct drops of bright red blood that had fallen from Clara's lip, currently staining the polished floorboards. You want me to scrub the floor with my clothes?" The attach stammered in absolute disbelief, his ego making one final, pathetic, desperate stand. "I will absolutely not. I am a dignitary of—" Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply shifted his gaze over the crowd, locking eyes with Illinois Gordon near the door. "Illinois," Bumpy said calmly, the name carrying through the room with devastating clarity. "Our distinguished foreign guests seem to believe they have a choice in this matter. Please come over here and carefully explain the severe consequences of their stubbornness. Start with the loudest one's fingers. Break them slowly, one exact joint at a time." The attach heard the heavy, terrifying sound of Illinois Gordon's massive boots slowly pushing off the front doors. He heard the metallic, echoing click of the large switchblade being snapped shut and slipped back into a heavy pocket. He heard the slow, deliberate, violently heavy footsteps approaching from behind him. The absolute mind-shattering terror finally completely broke the billionaire's spirit. The remaining fragment of his ego shattered into a million irreparable pieces. No, please, wait. Stop." The attach shrieked, his voice reaching a pathetic, desperate, high-pitched register. He violently threw his hands down onto the wet, sticky floorboards, ignoring the sharp, biting pain of the broken crystal slicing into his palms. "I will do it. I will do it. Please, just keep him away from me." "Then begin," Bumpy commanded, his voice an iceberg, "and do not leave a single microscopic drop." The attach, a man who had never performed a single second of physical labor in his entire privileged, sheltered life, awkwardly, frantically grabbed the lapels of his incredibly expensive silk suit. He violently pulled the heavy fabric down over his trembling hands to protect them from the sharp glass. He pressed the shimmering, delicate Italian silk firmly against the sticky hardwood floor. He began to scrub. It was a slow, agonizing, profoundly humiliating process. The attach was practically crawling on his hands and knees, sweeping the expensive fabric back and forth across the spilled vintage cognac. The delicate silk instantly absorbed the dark amber liquid, turning the shimmering material into a heavy, disgusting, sticky brown rag. To his right, the three other billionaires, completely terrified by the rapidly approaching footsteps of Illinois Gordon, violently tore off their own custom-tailored suit jackets. They desperately dropped to their knees, bunching up the expensive fabric in their trembling hands, and frantically began to scrub the floorboards alongside their leader. The scene was intensely surreal, a profound, almost mythological inversion of absolute power. Four of the wealthiest, most legally protected, politically connected men on the face of the earth were currently reduced to weeping, trembling janitors, frantically scrubbing a nightclub floor with clothing that cost more than the building itself. Bumpy stood perfectly still, watching them with cold, assessing eyes. He didn't gloat. He didn't laugh. He simply observed the absolute, necessary destruction of their arrogance. Careful with the broken glass, Bumpy instructed smoothly, his tone heavily laced with dark, terrifying mockery. I would hate for you to accidentally catch whatever terrible diseases you believe we carry in our blood. Make sure you gather every single sharp piece. Use your pockets if you must. The attached choked back a loud sob of pure, unadulterated humiliation. His hands were bleeding steadily. His knees were completely soaked and throbbing with intense pain. The heavy smell of the spilled alcohol mixed with the metallic scent of his own fear was violently making him nauseous. He carefully, frantically gathered the dangerous shards of broken green crystal, desperately stuffing the sharp pieces directly into the ruined pockets of his expensive trousers, desperate to appease the quiet, terrifying man towering above him. The massive crowd of Harlem locals watched the entire humiliating spectacle in stunned, absolutely reverent silence. They witnessed the untouchable gods brought completely down to the dirty earth. They saw the heavy, absolute justice of their hidden kingdom administered with flawless, terrifying precision. They felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the billionaire's initial disrespect being forcefully scrubbed away, replaced by the undeniable physical proof of Bumpy Johnson's absolute sovereignty. For 10 agonizing, violently slow minutes, the only sound inside Small's paradise was the desperate, wet, scraping noise of heavy silk grinding against the wooden floorboards, mixed with the quiet, pathetic, trembling sobs of the broken diplomats. They scrubbed until their hands were heavily blistered and bleeding. They scrubbed until their incredibly expensive suits were completely unrecognizable, heavy, soaked, sticky brown rags completely covered in dirt, alcohol, and blood. They meticulously wiped up the spilled ice, the shattered glass, and the tiny drops of blood, polishing the wood until it was completely spotless. Finally, the attached slowly stopped moving. His arms were shaking violently with intense fatigue and pure terror. He remained entirely on his hands and knees, staring down at his ruined reflection in the damp wood. The floor was completely clean. It is done, the attached whispered, his voice completely broken, lacking absolutely any trace of its former arrogant authority. He didn't dare to look up at Bumpy. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the floorboards, displaying the total, complete submission of a thoroughly conquered enemy. Please, are we allowed to leave now? Bumpy did not answer immediately. He slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of his midnight blue jacket. He calmly withdrew a brand new, perfectly rolled Cuban cigar. He placed the thick tobacco carefully between his teeth. He withdrew a silver lighter, snapping the wheel. The bright orange flame illuminated his cold, stony features in the dim red light. He took a long, slow draw, filling his lungs with the rich smoke, before exhaling a thick cloud directly over the heads of the kneeling billionaires. "Silas," Bumpy called out softly, without looking away from the men on the floor. The terrified manager practically jumped out of his skin. He slowly, hesitantly stepped forward from the protective shadows of the bar, his hands wringing his towel nervously. "Yes, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy casually pointed his cigar at the massive, scattered pile of crisp $100 bills that were still completely covering the floor nearby. The exact money the attach had violently thrown into Silas's face. "Collect the garbage off the floor, Silas," Bumpy ordered smoothly. "Count every single dollar. Take whatever is strictly necessary to completely cover the cost of the destroyed vintage bottles and the ruined tray. Give absolutely every single remaining cent of it directly to Clara. Tell her it is a small, necessary severance package. She will not be working for the remainder of the month. She is to take a paid vacation to heal her face." Silas nodded frantically, profound relief instantly washing over his sweating face. "Yes, Mr. Johnson. Absolutely, Mr. Johnson. Right away." Bumpy finally looked back down at the attach. The billionaire was still trembling violently, his forehead practically touching the floorboards. "You may slowly stand up," Bumpy commanded softly. The 4 billionaires scrambled awkwardly to their feet. They were a completely pathetic, destroyed sight. Their expensive, tailored trousers were soaked, torn, and heavily stained with dirt and blood. Their hands were violently cut and bleeding. Their hair was wild and unkempt. They clutched their ruined, soaking wetsuit jackets to their chests like deeply traumatized children holding on to dirty security blankets. They refused to make eye contact with absolutely anyone in the room. "You are going to slowly, quietly walk out of my establishment," Bumpy instructed, his voice entirely devoid of anger, replaced entirely by cold, absolute finality. "You are going to walk straight out those front doors. You are going to quietly get into your expensive, heavily armored limousines. You are going to drive directly back down to your beautiful, safe embassies in Manhattan." Bumpy took a slow, intimidating step closer, entirely invading the attach's personal space. The billionaire squeezed his eyes shut, physically flinching in terror. "And when you are sitting completely safely in your expensive leather chairs," Bumpy whispered, his voice a dark, terrifying promise, "when you are drinking your imported coffee and feeling terribly brave again, you will absolutely not call the police. You will absolutely not file a formal diplomatic complaint. You will completely swallow your wounded pride, and you will fundamentally understand how incredibly lucky you are to be breathing." Bumpy paused, letting the heavy threat sink deep into the man's fractured psyche. "Because if I ever hear your name whispered on these streets again," Bumpy stated, his eyes completely dead and devoid of mercy, "if you ever dare to bring your arrogant, disrespectful shadow back above 110th Street, the heavy iron chains will firmly lock the doors again. And next time, I will not simply ask you to clean the floor. I will make you disappear underneath it." The attach nodded frantically, violently, repeatedly. The absolute, unadulterated terror in his eyes confirmed that the terrifying message had been deeply, permanently received. His arrogance was completely gone, entirely burned away by the heavy, unforgiving reality of the Harlem underworld. Bumpy looked over the terrified men. He gave a slow, microscopic nod of dismissal. He didn't need to shout to the door. He simply turned his head. Illinois Gordon saw the signal. The massive enforcer slowly produced a small brass key from his vest pocket and inserted it into the heavy brass padlock. Click. The lock snapped open. The loud, mechanical sound echoed through the silent club like a gunshot. Illinois slowly, deliberately unwound the massive, rusted iron chains from the heavy brass handles. The metal links clanked loudly against the floorboards as he pulled them completely free, violently dragging them back behind the heavy velvet curtains. He pulled the massive oak double doors wide open, allowing the thick, humid exhaust-filled summer air of the city to immediately flood back into the tense, air-conditioned room. "Leave," Bumpy commanded. The four billionaires did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. They didn't speak. They didn't look back. They practically stumbled over one another in their desperate, pathetic rush to completely escape the terrifying room. They scrambled wildly toward the open doors, slipping slightly on the polished floorboards, their ruined, soaked clothing leaving a completely pathetic trail of dirty, sticky water behind them. They practically fell out onto the concrete sidewalk, disappearing instantly into the dark, protective shadows of the Harlem night. The heavy, suffocating tension in the nightclub instantly evaporated, completely vacuumed out through the open doors. The absolute silence lingered for a long, heavy moment. Then, slowly, the undeniable rhythm of the kingdom began to return. A single man near the bar began to clap his hands, a slow, respectful, heavy rhythm. Another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire crowded room of Small's Paradise erupted into a massive, thunderous, unified wave of applause. Men were cheering wildly, stamping their heavy shoes on the floorboards. Women were smiling, tears of profound relief and fierce pride shining brightly in their eyes. They were not clapping for a gangster. They were clapping for the heavy, absolute gravity that kept their chaotic world in balance. They were celebrating the fierce, undeniable protection of a man who demanded absolute respect for his people, regardless of who stood against them. Bumpy Johnson completely ignored the massive applause. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He did not seek their validation or their praise. He was simply doing exactly what the heavy, unforgiving crowd demanded of him. He calmly turned around, his Italian loafers completely avoiding the clean, polished spot on the floorboards. He walked slowly, smoothly, straight back to his isolated, red-tinted corner booth. He slid perfectly back into the deeply shadowed leather seat. He placed his newly lit Cuban cigar into the heavy crystal ashtray. He slowly reached out and picked up his glass of neat, top-shelf bourbon. The amber liquid caught the dim red light perfectly. He took a slow, measured, completely calm sip of the liquor. Up on the small wooden stage, the terrified trumpet player slowly wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead. He looked down at his worn, scuffed shoes. He looked out over the massive, celebrating crowd. He raised his shiny brass horn back to his lips, took a deep, shaky breath, and perfectly blew the opening, vibrant notes of a fast-paced, celebratory bebop standard. The heavy, infectious music completely filled the room once again. The people began to move. The glasses began to clink. The vibrant, resilient soul of Harlem violently roared back to life. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat completely silently in the dark, heavy shadows, his intelligent, assessing eyes scanning the bustling room. The absolute, unyielding order of the universe had been successfully maintained. The dangerous, arrogant tourists had been taught a terrifying, unforgettable lesson about immunity. And the indisputable King of Harlem slowly took another drink, entirely ready for whatever complicated, violent chess move the unpredictable city would inevitably play next.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.